As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine an empire that for decades has been accustomed to dictating terms to its allies. A country whose power was based not only on its army, on its technology, but also on the certainty that no one would dare to challenge it. And suddenly, in an instant, that certainty begins to crack. Not because of tanks at the border or missile strikes, but because of the silent decision of millions of people on the other side of the world's longest border.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
No protests, no slogans. Just one quiet gesture: closed wallets. Millions of Canadians stopped traveling to the US, booking hotels, gambling in Las Vegas casinos, and spending billions in shopping malls in border towns. Tourism is collapsing. Airlines are canceling flights. Restaurants are closing. What yesterday seemed like a solid source of income for the American economy is now turning into a hole through which billions are flowing out. At first glance, it may seem like a whim of neighbors or a temporary pause in travel. But there is much more behind this silent boycott. It is a response to decades of neglect, threats, and pressure. When Canada was perceived not as an equal partner, but as a junior ally who was told what to buy, what planes to build, and what military programs to support. When Washington insisted on buying the most expensive and problematic fighter jets in history, regardless of the price or the consequences.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
And suddenly it turned out that the most polite neighbors had a weapon, far more destructive than any weapon in the arsenal. It is economic resistance. Quiet, invisible, but deadly. America lost billions of dollars literally overnight. Not because someone attacked its system, but because 38 million people made a choice. Their money would no longer work for those who treat them as customers rather than allies. This story is not about tourism. It is a story about how the understanding of power has changed in the 21st century. Where aircraft carriers and nuclear missiles once reigned supreme, today consumer behavior and economic solidarity are the deciding factors. One closed wallet can strike a blow stronger than sanctions and blockades. But the most alarming thing for Washington is not even the billions lost. The real threat is that other allies are watching Canada closely. Europe, Mexico, Japan. They see that it is possible to resist without war, without loud slogans, and with much more tangible results. And if Canada, a country with a reputation as the most peaceful and loyal neighbor, has succeeded, what is stopping the others?
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Today, we will examine how ordinary tourists became the main threat to the empire, how the story of an aviation project buried decades ago still resonates in the hearts of Canadians, and why a closed wallet has become a weapon against which the US has no defense. This is a story about how the balance of power in North America has changed and why the whole world is watching this quiet revolution closely. It all started almost imperceptibly. Statistics from border crossings showed a drop in the number of trips by a few percent, and Washington considered it a seasonal fluctuation. But after a couple of months, the figures became an alarm signal. Car traffic from Canada to the US plummeted by almost 40%, and the number of airline tickets purchased by Canadians to American resorts fell by a quarter. Las Vegas tourism lost half of its regular visitors from the north, and in Florida, businesses estimated losses of more than $6 billion in a single season. For many Americans, this looked like another economic downturn, but experienced observers understood that this time the reason was completely different. It was not a global recession, a pandemic, or even terrorist attacks. It was a conscious choice by our neighbors, silent but devastating.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
In border towns, restaurants that had been thriving for decades on Canadian tourists' weekend visits began to close. Shopping mall owners in Buffalo complained that up to 70% of their revenue had disappeared in just 1 year. Airlines canceled flights that had been considered stable and profitable for decades. Local authorities tried to save the situation with discounts and advertising campaigns, but nothing helped. It was as if the Canadians had conspired. Their wallets slammed shut, and they no longer wanted to finance the neighboring economy. For businesses, it was a disaster. One manager of a large hotel in Orlando told reporters, "I survived 9/11, the global crisis, and COVID lockdowns. But I've never seen a blow like this, when an entire category of customers just disappears." His words were echoed by others: casino owners in Nevada, restaurateurs in New York, air carriers in Chicago. Hundreds of thousands of jobs tied to tourists from the north were at risk. But most importantly, it did not look like a spontaneous reaction. Everything happened too synchronously, too consistently to be a coincidence. The Canadian tourists seemed to be saying that they were no longer willing to support their neighboring empire, which for years had treated them as customers rather than partners. This silence and lack of official statements concealed a threat far more serious than high-profile political scandals. Washington was confronted with a new weapon of the 21st century: closed wallets.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
To understand why this economic war began now, we need to look back and see how discontent has been building. At first, it was hurtful jokes. The phrase that Canada could become the 51st state provoked laughter in the American audience, but left a bitter taste in the mouths of its northern neighbors. Then came trade tariffs, which were perceived as punishment for trying to defend their own interests. Harsh words were added about NATO, where Canada was portrayed as a weak link that did not fulfill its obligations. And although all this was considered normal political rhetoric in Washington, in Ottawa and in the hearts of ordinary Canadians, a feeling gradually formed that they were not being treated as equal allies, but as a dependent territory. But the issue was not limited to contemporary conflicts. Canadians have a memory, and it holds much deeper wounds. One of the symbols of this was the story of the Avro Pro project. In the 1950s, Canada developed one of the most advanced fighter jets of its time. It was a real technological breakthrough that could have put the country on a par with the major aviation powers. But under pressure from the US, the project was scrapped, thousands of engineers lost their jobs, and the Canadian aviation industry was set back decades. For some, this became a long-forgotten historical fact, but for others, it was a reminder of how their southern neighbors knew how to suppress ambitions when they threatened their leadership. When Donald Trump began openly threatening Canada with trade wars and questioning its independence, this old resentment was revived. Voices began to be heard in society saying that it was time to show that the country did not have to obey orders from Washington. And while such ideas had previously remained at the level of political debate, they have now grown into concrete actions by millions of people.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Even in everyday conversations, Canadians increasingly said they did not want to feed the American economy. Elderly couples who had been renting condos in Florida for decades refused to renew their contracts. Young people who used to prefer weekends in Vegas began looking for cheap flights to Europe and Asia. Tour operators noted that demand for Mexico and the Caribbean had grown by tens of percent. The money hadn't disappeared, it just stopped going to the US. This came as a shock to American analysts. They were used to considering Canada a reliable source of income. 1 in 5 foreign tourists in the US is Canadian, and visitors from the north have always spent more than average. Losing this flow meant more than just a drop in statistics. It was a threat to entire industries, from hotels to air travel. Some American experts began to call what was happening a silent economic strike. Not bombs, not sanctions, but the simple choice of millions of people proved stronger than any diplomatic protests. And this is what caused real panic in the corridors of power. How to respond to a threat against which there is no military defense or political tools.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Of course, there was some exaggeration. Some media outlets reported that entire suburbs of American cities were becoming deserted due to the absence of Canadian shoppers. In reality, the decline in turnover was in the tens of percent. But even that was enough to dampen the mood. In Las Vegas, there was even talk that the closure of several large casinos was due to the loss of Canadian gamblers. The reality was more complex. The pandemic, rising prices, and competition also played a role, but it was symbolic that the Canadian factor was cited as the decisive one. Thus, step by step, a picture emerged in which the most polite and peaceful neighbor of the United States became a source of economic threat. And most importantly, this happened without shouting and demonstrations. It was a cold calculation dictated by years of accumulated discontent. And now the American elite had to answer the question, what is more dangerous, loud protests in the streets, or millions of quietly closed wallets? The culmination of the accumulated irritation was the story with the F-35 fighter jet. This is not just a weapons contract, but the most expensive project in the history of military aviation, estimated at $1.7 trillion. Washington did not simply offer Canada to join, it demanded it, hinting that refusal could threaten the integrity of NORAD, the Joint Defense System of North America. To Ottawa, this sounded less like an allied dialogue and more like an ultimatum. For the first time in decades, Canadians openly felt that their security was being used as a tool of pressure rather than a common cause. The problem was also that the F-35 itself, as it turned out, was far from ideal. On paper, it was supposed to be a universal new generation aircraft, but in practice it was 5 years behind schedule and billions over budget. Mission readiness did not exceed 50% on average, and the safety systems caused concern even among American experts. Reports mentioned helmets that prevented pilots from seeing at night, engines that overheated in cold climates, and ejection seats that were dangerous for lightweight pilots.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
In Canada, all this data caused a strong reaction. People asked the obvious question, why spend tens of billions on an aircraft that is barely half operational when there are alternatives on the market? The Swedish Gripen, the European Typhoon, and the French Rafale were all considered as real options. Even New Zealand, which traditionally relies on the US, openly advised Canada to diversify its purchases. For Washington, such reasoning sounded like betrayal, but for Canadians, it was the first step toward independence. It was particularly symbolic that it was the issue of aircraft that revived memories of the old Avro Arrow story, which had already been discussed earlier. A parallel arose in society. Back in the 1950s, the US crushed the Canadian aviation project, and the country lost its chance to become a leader in this industry. Today, decades later, another attempt was made to impose a foreign aircraft, depriving Canada of its right to choose. The response was not only resistance from politicians, but also from ordinary citizens. Many saw that the controversy surrounding the F-35 was not just a technical issue, but a symbolic clash. As a result, the silent tourist boycott intensified and was joined by political support for alternatives. Newspapers wrote that if Canada signed a contract for American aircraft, thousands of people would be ready to support a campaign for economic redirection, that is, for even more extensive closure of their wallets. In this atmosphere, a strategy linked to new priorities came to the fore. Military spending did indeed begin to rise, as Washington demanded, but the trajectory of this spending turned out to be unexpected. Instead of turning into a stream of money for Lockheed Martin, it became a tool for diversification. Canada began negotiations with countries in Europe and Asia, and these negotiations were not only about the purchase of equipment, they were about creating joint production facilities, exchanging technologies, and localizing jobs on Canadian territory.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
This approach had a dual effect. First, it reduced dependence on the US. Second, it created new jobs within the country, which made this policy extremely popular among the population. Newspapers wrote about dozens of businesses that could open in Manitoba and Quebec if Canada chose European fighter jets. Unlike the American proposals, where jobs were guaranteed in Texas or California, the Europeans were prepared to build factories in Canada. Washington reacted to this extremely painfully. Behind the scenes, there were threats to reduce military cooperation, and there was even talk of revising the terms of defense in the Arctic. But these threats only strengthened public opinion. People saw that the US was trying to dictate terms, and this was perceived as pressure that they no longer wanted to tolerate. Meanwhile, the money that was no longer going to American tourism began to work in other areas. Canadian tourists discovered new destinations. Mexico recorded a record influx of northern visitors. European capitals reported a 20 to 30% increase in bookings, and Asian resorts even launched advertising Canadian dollars. For the global economy, this was a signal. Canada had not stopped spending. It had simply redirected its resources to places where it was respected. Something similar was happening in the defense sector. Along with the aircraft negotiations, Canada was signing agreements with European partners on joint projects involving drones and surveillance systems in the Arctic. Some analysts argued that, for the first time in decades, this area was no longer a NORAD monopoly and had become a space for multilateral cooperation. For the US, this meant the loss not only of contracts but also of symbolic leadership. When your closest ally shows that it can do without American technology, it hits the entire system, especially if that ally is a country that has always been considered the most reliable. Interestingly, this course of action generated a rare consensus within Canada. Both left-wing and right-wing parties supported the idea of diversification. Some emphasized jobs, others emphasized national independence. Even businesses, traditionally oriented toward the US, began to recognize that complete dependence on a single partner made the country vulnerable. All this came together in a new strategy that many experts called a quiet revolution. It did not require loud slogans or drastic measures. On the contrary, its strength lay in its calm consistency. Tourism was redirected to other countries. Military spending was directed not to a single corporation, but to a network of partnerships. Diplomacy expanded through the Arctic and new technology projects. Washington found itself in a difficult situation. Officially, the US continued to declare that Canada was a loyal ally, but behind closed doors, they discussed the risks. The loss of tens of billions in Canadian orders was a blow to the American military-industrial complex, and the example set by Canada could inspire other allies. If its northern neighbor is capable of saying no, why shouldn't Europe or Japan try? Thus, the dispute over the F-35 became a turning point. It became a symbol that Canada was no longer willing to make decisions under pressure. Instead of bowing to threats, the country used new tools: the economy, the market, consumer choice. And that is what made its position stronger. Analysts noted that for the first time in a long time, the US was faced with an adversary that could not be intimidated by sanctions or military force. This was because the adversary was not governments and armies, but millions of people whose wallets had become the quietest and most powerful weapon. Against the backdrop of this weapon, the threat not to buy American aircraft did not appear to be a sign of weakness, but rather a demonstration of new independence. It was at this moment that it became clear the balance of power in North America was beginning to shift. And even if Canada does end up buying a few American planes in a few years, the very fact of its resistance has already changed the rules of the game. When the world saw that Canada was able to strike without weapons, without sanctions, and without harsh statements, international capitals began to carefully analyze this experience. Until then, it was believed that in the global system, all roads led to Washington in one way or another. Allies could express dissatisfaction, argue about tariffs, but in the end, they accepted American conditions. Canada showed a different scenario. An ally can change the rules of the game if it uses its economic influence. This had a domino effect. Behind closed doors in Europe, discussions began about whether similar pressure tactics could be used in negotiations with the US. Germany and France did not speak out openly, but analysts noted a growing interest in the Canadian model. Reports from European centers mentioned that if Ottawa managed to do without American technology and redirect tourism, then other countries could act in a similar way. Even in Japan, which for decades had been considered Washington's most loyal ally in Asia, there was talk of the need to expand ties with Southeast Asia and Australia in order to avoid dependence on the US alone. This was an alarming signal for Washington. The losses in tourism and military contracts were painful, But what proved to be far more dangerous was that allies began to perceive America not as an indispensable partner, but as one option among many. This struck at what could be called the currency of the empire, trust. Empires are not only sustained by their armies and economies, but also by their allies' belief that cooperation with the center is profitable and safe. If this belief is destroyed, the entire structure collapses.